Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on social media and wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd like to thank our listeners. If you enjoy our show, please write us a review. Also, share it with a friend. This episode is brought to you by Letting Sleeping Dogs Lie. Tonight, by listener request, we'll finish the story of Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle was originally a short story by the American author Washington Irving, published in 1819. It follows a Dutch-American villager in colonial America named Rip Van Winkle, who falls asleep in the Catskill Mountains and wakes up 20 years later, having missed the American Revolution. Irving wrote it while in England and later admitted he had never been to the Catskill Mountains when he wrote the story. When we left off, Rip awakens from his long sleep on the mountain and walks back to town, unaware of how long he had been asleep. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. By the time Rip had entered the village street, and a group of children gathered at his heels. At that, his eyes brightened, and his face lost some of that half-puzzled, half-frightened expression. Here, at least, was something to which he was accustomed. But instead of the smiles and shouts of joy which formerly greeted him, these children hooted rudely and pointed to his beard. Then indeed Rip's heart began to fail within him. What was the matter that in one night everything had changed so, and nothing seemed as it was only yesterday? And now he came to think of it, after a single night, the village appeared much bigger, and the fields that were green when he went up the mountain were full of houses today. Even the very dogs did not know him, and perhaps that was worst of all. I am bewitched, thought Rip. It can't all be that flagon. He turned to go to his own house, but the very road to it was altered, and he lost his way once more. At last, he struck into a path which he recognized, and he stopped for a moment, expecting to hear his wife's voice scolding him. But all was still, and as he drew nearer, he saw that the roof had fallen in, and the glass of the windows was broken. A half-starved dog was prowling round, and with a throb of joy, Rip whistled and called to him, "Woof, woof, come here, good dog." But the dog snarled and showed his teeth before trotting away. Was it Wolf or not? Rip never knew. Inside, The house was as desolate as without, and very unlike to what Rip had been accustomed to see. Though he felt it was useless, he shouted the names of his wife and children. Then a thrill of fear passed through him, and not daring to look behind him, he hurried back to the street. "I must go have a drink," he said. "Of course, I had no breakfast, and that has made my head get funny. A little food will set me right." So he hastened on to the village inn, and, being busy with his thoughts, walked with his eyes on the ground till his feet unconsciously halted at the old place. Then he glanced up, but only to receive another shock. The ancient structure, with its latticed panes and gabled roof, was gone, and instead he beheld a long sort of wooden shed, untidy and dirty, the windows more holes than glass, and stuffed with old hats or even petticoats to keep out the air. Over the door was painted a sign bearing the words, "Union Hotel by Jonathan Doolittle." In the room of the great tree in front, where he and his friends had smoked so many pipes, was a pole crowned with a sort of red nightcap from which a flag fluttered. An odd kind of flag it was, too, for when the wind blew it out, you saw, not the familiar crisscross lines of the Union Jack, but stars and stripes which had never appeared on any English banner as far as Rip knew. And when his eyes fell upon the sign, where a very pink-faced King George in a red coat was wont to gaze at his loyal subjects, he too had vanished, and given place to a gentleman in blue and buff, holding a sword instead of a scepter, while underneath was painted in large letters, "General Washington." From the inn, Rip turned to the crowd that stood about it, and even here the strange alteration that pervaded everything and everybody was visible. There was none of the former air of calm and leisure characteristic of the friends who had sat with him round the tree yesterday, or was it 100 years ago? This crowd was noisy and bustling and inclined to quarrel, full of plans and inventions to judge by the talk, and eager to discuss and find fault with the contents of a handbill which one of their number was handing out. Rip did not understand much of what they were saying, but he caught such phrases as "members of Congress," "Bunker's Hill," "Liberty," and other expressions as meaningless to him as if they were uttered in a foreign tongue. It was some time before he noticed that to the villagers on their side he himself was an object of great interest and curiosity. They pressed round him and made remarks to each other about his strange dress and the rust on his gun, while the little man with the handbills pushed his way up to him and inquired how he had voted, which Rip, who had not the least idea what he meant, answered merely with a stare. Another, who desired to know whether he was a Federal or a Democrat, fared no better. But a third questioner, who asked why he had come to the election with a gun on his shoulder and a mob at his heels, and if he intended to head a riot, at last gave Rip back his power of speech. "Alas, gentlemen," he cried, "I am a poor, quiet man, a native of this village, and a loyal subject of King George." The tumult that broke forth at his reply nearly deafened him. "A spy! A spy!" shouted the people. "Away with him! To the gallows with him!" And it might have gone hardly with Rip had not a man in a cocked hat interfered and called them to order. The man next demanded of Rip what he wanted and why he was there, to which Rip humbly made answer that he had come in search of his neighbors who he had been used to meet at the tavern. "Well, give us their names," said the man in the cocked hat. "Nicholas Vedder, the innkeeper," answered Rip. There was a moment's silence. Then an old man, in a thin, piping voice, spoke. "Nicholas Vedder? Why, he's dead and gone in these 18 years, and even his wooden tombstone in the churchyard is gone rotten." "And Bram Dutcher?" "Oh, he enlisted as a soldier in the beginning of the war. Some say he was killed at the storming of Stony Point. Others, that he was drowned in a squall off Antony's Nose. Anyway, he never came back here." "And Van Bummel, the schoolmaster?" He went off to the wars too, and became a general, and is now a member of Congress." Rip asked no further questions. His home and his friends were gone, and he seemed to be alone in the world. At length a cry of despair broke from him. "Does anybody know Rip Van Winkle?" "Rip Van Winkle?" answered 2 or 3. "Oh, to be sure. There's Rip Van Winkle leaning against that tree." Rip looked where they pointed and grew more bewildered and despairing than ever. For what he saw was himself. Himself as he had been yesterday when he went up the mountain. Himself in the rags that he had worn with such a light heart. "And what is your name?" asked the man in the cocked hat, watching his face. "God knows," cried Rip. "I don't know who I am. I'm not myself. I'm somebody else. That's me yonder. At least, I can't tell. He seems to have got into my shoes. I was myself last night, but I fell asleep on the mountain, and they changed my gun, and now everything is changed, and I'm changed, and I don't know what is my name or who I am." When he had ceased, the bystanders looked at each other, and tapping their foreheads, whispered something about taking away the gun so that he might not do himself a mischief. They were still talking when a pleasant-faced woman pushed through the crowd to get a peep of the stranger with the long beard. His looks frightened the child she was carrying, and it began to cry. "Hush, Rip, hush," she said. "The old man won't hurt you." As he heard her words, Rip started and turned towards her eagerly. "What is your name?" he asked. "Judith Gardner." "And who is your father?" "Ah, a poor man. He was Rip Van Winkle, but he went away from home more than 20 years agone. He took his dog and his gun with him, and the dog was found lying in front of the door early next morning. But as for Father, whether he shot himself by accident or was carried away by the Indians, we never knew. I was only a little girl then. And your mother? Oh, she died only a short time since. She flew into such a passion with a peddler who she thought had cheated her that she broke a blood vessel. But though Rip had inquired after his wife, all affection for her had long died away, and he did not take this news much to heart. He flung his arms round his daughter and cried, "I am your father. Don't you know me? Young Rip Van Winkle once, now old Rip Van Winkle. Does nobody know poor Rip Van Winkle?" The crowd heard, amazed, and in silence. Then suddenly, an old woman went up to him and peered closely into his face. "Why, 'tis Rip Van Winkle for sure," she said. "Welcome home, neighbor. Where have you been these long 20 years? Rip's story was soon told, but the people who listened to it had as much difficulty in believing that you could sleep for 20 years and think it was one night as Rip himself. Mad was the only interpretation they put upon the tale, though they did not say so openly. In the midst of the general perplexity, an old man was seen coming along the road, and someone called out, "Here is Peter Vanderdonk. Let us ask him if he ever knew of such doings." "Aye, let us. He is the oldest dweller in the village, and we will abide by his words." The rest answered in chorus, and they watched intently till Peter came up. "Why, 'tis Rip Van Winkle back again," he exclaimed, just as the old woman had done. "Right glad I am to see him, too." Who can tell the joy of poor Rip at this hearty greeting? So he was no ghost after all, as he had almost begun to think, but a flesh and blood man with friends like other people. He could hardly speak for happiness, but he grasped Peter's hand tightly, and then the man with the cocked hat asked Peter if he had ever heard any strange stories of the Catskill Mountains. "Aye, that I have, many a time," replied Peter. "My grandfather, he was mighty taken up with all such things, told me that the great Hendrik Hudson, who first came over from Europe and gave his name to the river, held a feast up there once in every 20 years with the crew of his ship, the Half Moon. My old father had actually beheld them playing at ninepins in the hollow of the mountains. And though I never saw anything myself," finished Peter, "I heard the sound of their balls one summer afternoon, and anybody who did not know would have thought it was thunder." After this, the crowd broke up and went about its own concerns, and Rip returned with his daughter to her own house. Her husband was one of the children he had played with long ago, and he was now a thriving farmer. Rip's son, whom he had seen leaning against the tree, was supposed to be employed on the farm, but he was no more fond of attending to his own work than his father before him. Little by little, Rip slipped back into his former life and gathered about him those of his old friends that were still left. But now, as in the days of long ago, it was the children whom he loved best. And when they grew tired of romping together, he would sit down on some green knoll while they climbed about him and tell them the tale of which they never grew weary, of his night on the Catskills. None of you who read this story are old enough to remember the wonderful American actor Jefferson, who played Rip Van Winkle, till he grew at last to feel he was more Rip Van Winkle than Jefferson. But those who did see him act will never forget it, nor his burst of despair when he came home to be repudiated and denied by everyone.